In addition to his "this is the best of all possible worlds" approach, Leibniz also advances the analogy of the boat. Here's the idea. And this is from his work, The Odyssey. And the Odyssey is, again, the branch of philosophy and theology that deals with trying to solve the problem of evil. So, here's the setup. And again, an analogy, as we saw in previous occasions, involves comparing two things to say that because they're alike in certain ways, they're alike in this other way, to try to prove a claim by comparison. So he begins with the following setup. Imagine, if you will, there is a river, and upon the river there are boats, and they're drifting down the river. Now the current of the river is carrying along these boats, and they differ only in cargo. So the boats that are most heavily laden will go slower because of the matter, which is inclined to slowness, or, using some sort of more fancy terms, a privation of speed. Now he says here, this does not lessen the speed, as that would be action, but moderates the effect by its receptivity, since the more matter is moved by the same force of the current, when the boat is more laden, it must go slower. So essentially what he's saying is this. You got boats being pushed by the current, the boats with more cargo go slower because they receive less speed. Now this may seem kind of odd if you think about it, because normally we talk about them, being harder to push, that the boats would be resisting the current as opposed to receiving less speed. But this is intentional. He intentionally presents it as not that the boats are resisting the push of the river, it's that they are receiving less speed from it. And it's critical to his analogy, because if the boats are actually resisting the current, then this would create a problem for his analogy. So what is the second part of the analogy? What is this being compared to? Well, this is what it is. So in his analogy, the current is like the action of God. So God is like the current of the river. And what God does, according to Leibniz, is produce and maintain the positive qualities of creatures, gives creatures perfection. Not, again, mentioned this before, but by perfection, it doesn't mean that these entities are perfect. It means they're good, they're positive qualities. So all the positive qualities of all creatures, created things, come from God. Their being, their existence comes from God. Their force comes from God. So all the positive qualities come from God. Like them, according to Leibniz, all the movement of the boats in the current comes from the push of the current. So the current is God. The creatures are the boats. Now, what about the cargo? Well, in this case, the inertia of the matter is like, in the analogy, the natural imperfections of the creatures. So the slowness of the laden boat is like the defects in the qualities and actions of creatures. And so the current, according to Leibniz, causes the boats to move, but they don't cause the boats to be slower, to be slow. The current moves the boats, but doesn't make them slow. So in this analogy, God is the cause of all the positive qualities in the creatures, just like the current is the cause of the movement of the boats. And in the case of the boats, again, it's that they receive less. So, in terms of like putting blame on the boats, the cargo is to blame for their slower speed. Now, in the case of creatures, it's the limitation of the receptivity of the creature causes the defects. So the imperfection of creatures causes them to receive less from God. And he repeats again a point he made earlier, which is that evil is a privation. And here he's following the Platonist, St. Augustine, the Scholastics, and taking the view that God, this doesn't apply to Plato, of course, but that God is the cause of the material element of evil in the positive. That's to say, he does create everything. So you could say, yes, on one hand, he is responsible because he creates all the creatures, and if the creatures are evil, he did create them. But he gets off the hook because he doesn't create the formal element. He doesn't put evil, in them. He doesn't create a person and then put in some evil. The evil is a lack, is a defect. Again, going back to my analogy previously with Swiss cheese, when you make Swiss cheese from, say, a Swiss cheese kit, there's not a bag of holes in there. You don't go, oh crap, I forgot to pour the holes into the mix. We're going to have holeless, Swiss cheese. So the idea is that God is not the cause of sin, because in the case of going to the analogy of the boats, the river's current is a cause of the boat's speed, but is not the cause of the boat going slow. The defect of the boat, its extra weight, is what causes it to go slower. Likewise, in the case of creatures, people, it is not God is giving them all he can to make them as best as they can be, but their defects cause them to receive it less. Now, we could also use a modern analogy. We could call this the analogy of the smartphone. Imagine you have several smartphones with different batteries, and everyone's had a smartphone. And you know that after a while the batteries start to get defective, they hold less of a charge. Now, when you plug a bunch of smartphones into a charger, the charger is giving them all equal power, trying to charge them as well as it can. Now, the failing for the phones that are not getting as much charge is not a failing on the part of the charger, it's a failing on the part of the phones. Their batteries are defective. And so in the analogy of the smartphone and charger, of course, God would be like the charger, giving out the charge to everything. And the phones would be like, creatures, in this case, people, and the defects in the battery would be like the sins. So the imperfections of the batteries make them receive less. So every phone is getting full charge, but its defects cause it to receive less. So on Leibniz's account, that's how evil occurs. So true, he does admit God did create us with imperfections, but it's our fault because we're receiving less from God. And so he's not making us evil, he just made us defective. So we do evil. And Leibniz thinks this gets God off the hook. Now, one thing that this entails is this. Going back to the analogy of the charger, also the analogy of the boat, God is giving to creatures all that is positive, good and perfect. Again, the current is pushing all the boats equally. The charger is, in my analogy, charging all the phones equally. And so all the charge, all the push, all the goodness, comes from God. And so the creatures' defects and imperfections are limitations in the creature. Where do these come from? Well, referring back to, the previous discussion about evil as a privation, it's that these creatures and things are defective. They cannot receive as much. Just like the more heavily laden boat, or in my analogy of the cell phone, getting less charge. So why doesn't God make us perfect? Well, again, he answers the question the same way. God could not make us perfect without making us all God. So the implied option here is either you'd have to have everybody's God, which would be impossible, or you'd end up with, pantheism. You have one being and that's God. So because of this, since God cannot create another perfect being for logical reasons, there must be different degrees in the perfection of things and limitations of every kind. Therefore, according to Leibniz, problem of evil is solved. God has made the best world, but he can't make every creature perfect. It's not his fault. It's just the way that logic works. Now, given that Leibniz is an intellectualist, this seems like a fair move because God is accepting the limits of logic. He doesn't break those rules. Now, in contrast, the voluntarists, who believe that God can do anything, even the impossible, God could create a perfect world. And so the problem of evil would be much more damaging to voluntarists, because if God is all-powerful and can do the impossible, he could make a perfect world. And so the question would arise, why does he not? But Leibniz sidesteps that by being an intellectualist. So that takes us to the end of looking at Leibniz and the problem of evil. Next, we'll head to look at our good dead friend David Hume, looking at some skepticism and religion.